ladies and gentlemen, to This Spooky Dance, episode 6, and this one's going to be longer than 25 minutes. I'm here, as always, with my proverbial sparring partner, Gabriel.
Hello.
And I'm Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
How you doing, Gabriel?
I'm doing all right. We're I think we're talking about the Bellwich, right?
Yeah, so today we're talking about the Bellwich. And much like Centralia,
Hmm.
I ended up on a little dive because I kept hearing that the Bell Witch was the inspiration for the film The Blair Witch Project, and I am fairly confident that that's not true. These stories
Oh,
have
interesting.
they've got nothing in common. They have nothing in common. They've just got a similar sounding name. Um,
Well, to sort of jump on that. So I don't know. I've never heard of the Bellwitch. So I'm going in totally cold on this one. But just the idea that the Blair Witch and the Bell Witch were like the same thing. I don't know anything about the Bell Witch. I know a fair amount about the way that the Blair Witch was developed, and that lore was like made up by the filmmakers,
yeah,
like
it was
on
very
the go,
intricate
like
as well.
yeah, and it was and it was published on websites back in the 90s and stuff. Like, yeah, it seems to me that they weren't just like taking a story and adapting it.
So, if you can imagine for a second that you are a young 10-year-old me in 2004, um, there used to be a TV show called Mystery Hunters, which I referenced in our psychic episode, and it was basically the gist was there was famous urban legends and cryptids and things like that, and those would be investigated. And one of the episodes was on the Bell Witch. And that's how I came to learn about this. And the host, they went into the Bellwich Cave and things like that. And I don't remember that episode in particular. It just stuck with me. And then when we were thinking, oh, what are we going to do for the episode today? I thought, well, here we go. Let's dive back in. So,
Yeah.
the Bell Witch. Right. So we have to go back to 1817, and the case of the Bell Witch concerns the Bell family. So the Bell family were this decently well-off family living in Robertson County, Tennessee. So they lived in like the general sort of like the states that existed at that time. They were sort of on the East Coast, and then they moved out to Tennessee to set up home somewhere new, and
Mhm.
they moved and established a farmhouse and had a modest but successful life in Robertson County, Tennessee. It might not have been Robertson County then, but it is now. They lived along the Red River, and the family were the patriarch, John Bell, the matriarch, Lucy Bell, the daughter, Betsy Bell, and two sons, John Bell Jr. and Richard Williams Bell, who was the youngest son. Now, to my understanding, the Bell family actually had 6 children, but they don't come up in this story really, and I wasn't able to find their names. So I'm just talking about these 3, but he had other children. A couple had already flown the nest, and I believe they were young men who had started their own families by this point. John Bell was an elderly man. He was approaching 70. He was, I think, around 65 at this time. My maths isn't very good, but for the standards of literally the 1810s, he was an old dude. So they had set up this house. They had a farmhouse, they had land, they had slaves. So
Mm.
this puts you generally of like this is roughly where they are in terms of their wealth and stature. They're not big money, but these aren't poor, simple farm people either.
Right.
So, in 1817, John Bell goes out one day and he hears a noise. And when he checks the noise, he finds a large black dog. But this black dog has the head of a rabbit. Now, he freaks and he starts shooting at the creature and it runs away. He returns home that night, and that night, when the family go to bed, they start hearing banging and scratching all over the walls of their house. So they hear this and they understandably think it's some people being obnoxious trying to wind them up. So John gets his gun, he goes out there, and he's like, you guys get off my property. And there isn't anyone there. So this continues for a couple nights, and as each night passes, the noises get worse and worse, and they start to hear chains being dragged, they hear dogs that don't exist fighting, and eventually one night it sounds like there are noises coming from inside their house. Now, the children think, quite reasonably to be honest, that they might actually have a rat infestation. But when they search for it, they can't find any rats. So a fella called Dean, who is one of the Bell family's slaves, after a day's slave work, and he would go back to see his wife, he starts saying that he's been followed by a black dog. And Betsy Bell, the daughter, she reports seeing a girl in a green dress swinging from one of the trees.
Oh my God.
This continues. The noises continue, and then it starts to get violent. Betsy Bell, who is going to be a key player here, she gets the worst of these attacks. The kids have their bed sheets yanked off them in the night, objects moving around that shouldn't be moving around. But Betsy Bell, she's getting scratched, she's getting bruised, and she's at one point even stuck with pins. This entity, whatever it is, has a specific dislike of her. So it has a specific dislike of her. Now, eventually, they get to the point where they're hearing a voice talking to them. And the voice says to them that it has marked John Bell for death. Now, around this time, John has actually been experiencing paralysis in his mouth. Now, he puts two and two together and he goes, nope. So he's got a decision to make here. I need to speak to someone. I need to get help. But this is 1817. And going to the church and asking about this is a risky game. Because we're not that far removed from the Salem witch trials. We're within the span of about 200 years, and there's like this distinct possibility that you would go there and be like, help me, I think my house is haunted, and they would respond with, oh, so you're saying you're a witch? Get the stake, boys. So he goes and speaks to his friend James Johnson. Now, James Johnson is... Well, he hears this story and he's like, right, okay. And John Bell is obviously like, I'm not crazy, this is happening. And James, he believes him. And he goes and he stays at the house. And he, sure enough, sees these supernatural things going on. He's actually slapped. His son, John Johnston, not to be confused with John Bell, but James Johnston's son, John, they had to do these names, didn't they?
Of course.
John devised a test for the witch. He said, let's see if it knows something that no one outside of our family would know. So he asks the entity, what his step-grandmother would say to the slaves if they did something wrong. And the witch replied, "Hut, hut, what has happened now?" And it did so in a Dutch accent. So not only does it know what she said, it also knew that she was Dutch, not American. James goes, "Listen, bud, I can't help you here. You need a priest." Because what's he meant to do? Like, he's able to confirm, like, yeah, I've stayed there and it's a thing. And he says, "My house is being haunted and I need help." And sure enough, the news of the haunted house spreads around this town like wildfire. Now, Gabriel, what do you think would happen in this situation?
In terms of like their reactions to it,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, how do you think the town would react?
I would think it would be similar to the scene in Frankenstein with the mob or whatever would try to like excise the evil from this place.
So, here's what happened. John Bell's house basically becomes Disneyland. And people start showing up at his house wanting to see the paranormal shit and trying to get the ghosts to do stuff. And I think this fact is quite interesting because I would not be surprised if this is where a lot of the story comes from. Because from here you get multiple stories of what the haunting supposedly was. Some people say it was like a previous lover of John Bell's who tragically died. Other people said that the spirit told them that they were buried underneath the house and they were looking for their missing tooth. And sure enough, it turned out the Bell farm was built over Native American bodies,
shit.
which is, isn't all of America that, but...
Oh, yes.
But what really stuck was that the entity at one point in time claimed it was Kate Batts. Now, Kate Batts was a local woman and she had an unusual relationship with the rest of the town. She was considered to be quite weird, quite unusual. The town were always shifty around her. And I think this is convenient that the spirit happens to say that it's the same person that they are already skeptical of. Now, her brother had this heated dispute with John Bell over the sale of a slave, and despite it literally being her brother, not her, it didn't take long until the story got conflated as her having a personal disagreement with Bell. So now the attention is on Kate Bell. So, in a weird and fortunate twist, she wasn't lynched. America had reached the point now where they weren't just burning people at the accusation of being witches.
Oh, how sensible of them.
They were like, you know what? There's plausible deniability here, lads. She might not actually be doing it. She became known as the Bell Witch, because people in town thought she was a witch, and they thought she was tormenting the Bell family. So she became known as the Bell Witch. And what's so interesting to me about this story is that this story doesn't involve a witch, but the name the Bell Witch stuck because some people thought that Kate Batts was a witch and she was casting spells on the house. But we could almost end it here because it's like, there you go, there's your Bell Witch. But it goes on. It goes on for years, in fact. And you'll remember I mentioned before that Betsy, the eldest daughter, the spirit, had a particular dislike of her. And it continued to attack her, and she was engaged to be married to a nice gentleman, And the spirit threw a shit fit over this. She was so scared, in fact, of the idea that the spirit, the Bell Witch, could hurt her and her family, that she broke off the engagement.
Oh.
But now here
Jeez.
is where the story gets buck fucking wild, right? Now, as you might expect from the men of the time, John Bell's eldest sons served in the military. And their general was none other than future US President Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson gets wind of this haunting, and he at least attempts to rock up at their house and investigate it for himself. Now, he would do that were it not for the fact that his carriage gets stuck on the road and it won't move. And they get out and look, and there's no mud, nothing blocking the road. It just won't move. The horses are trying to move, and they can't do it. And they're like,
what the hell?
What's going on here? And then Andrew Jackson hears a voice say, I'll see you tonight. And suddenly, it's able to move again. So Jackson and company set up on the farm, on the grounds, and it seems to be going well until one soldier decides, yeah, I'm going to tempt fate. Why not? He at least claims to have a silver bullet in his gun, and he says that he's a witch hunter, and he says that that witch won't come anywhere near them because she knows he's got the silver bullet, and she knows that she'd get him. For those who might be listening who are thinking of werewolves right now, silver has always in folklore been considered to be something that kills or destroys evil. Not just necessarily werewolves, but vampires. Silver is often thought of that, so that's why he claims to have a silver bullet. So he says, I'm a witch hunter, I've got a silver bullet, and that witch ain't gonna do anything. And of course he proceeds to get 7 shades of shit kicks out of him. All of Jackson's men are terrified, and they leave. They're like, sorry family, did what we could, and there are forces here beyond our control, you know. We're just anyway, I'm off to go and run for president now. See you later.
Wow.
So finally we reach the 1820s, and John's health is fading fast. He is a 70-year-old man, and you know what, considering the time period, he hasn't done bad, has he?
Yeah.
So he starts experiencing what today a doctor would call seizures. And the whole time he reports, the witch keeps saying she's going to kill me. And then finally, after weeks of sickness, he dies. And the family reported finding a vial of black liquid in his room after he died. No one knew where it came from. No one knew what it was until they tested it on an animal and found that it was poison. John Bell's funeral is held, and it's huge. There are tons of people who never met him, didn't know him, but knew him by reputation. This was the man who was being haunted by the Bell Witch, and he has finally died. Did the Bell Witch kill him? And they all like flood to his funeral. At the funeral, the family, they say that they heard the Bell Witch say that she finally killed John Bell, and she'd be back in 7 years. By accounts, 7 years later, she did show up again. She just didn't do anything. She just sort of talked, and then she claimed she'd be back in 1935. And to this day, the descendants of the Bell family make the argument she never went anywhere, and she still haunts them now. But as you can imagine, in a time in which we've got cameras on every phone and can meticulously document anything via the internet, suddenly we're hearing far less about the Bell Witch.
Yeah.
But that is the story of the Bell Witch. You're clued in. sorry for like talking for like 15 straight minutes, but
No,
so that's the story.
I don't even know. I don't even know where to start. So the person whose name was actually Bell really had nothing to do with any of the. What did anybody ever explain or?
So the person whose name was actually Bell was the family that was being haunted.
Right.
But Kate Batts was the person that the town believed to be the Bell Witch, and because the spirit once claimed to be Kate Batts, and I think this is kind of clearly the town looking for a justification to not like that woman, because they were already suspicious of her to begin with.
Well, so this seems to have been a phenomenon that was so visceral. Clearly, the family believed that something was happening to them if the daughter called off an engagement because of this stuff. Like, did anybody ever posit an explanation for why this was actually happening, or like what this was, or?
So, from my reading, which is not exhaustive by any means, the explanation that I have found that I think is the most satisfactory is also the most boring one, which is that it just didn't happen. Often, you look at a story like this and you want to find what the elements of truth to the story are, but there aren't really any sources at the time in the 1820s really reporting on it. So what we mostly know about it comes from the book An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch by Martin Ingram. And he wrote this account in 1894, which is well over 70 years after the haunting started. So he wasn't alive at the time, and he claims that his accounts were based on the diaries and writings of Richard Williams Bell, who was the youngest son that I mentioned earlier. Now, that seems like a good source. The thing is Richard Bell didn't start writing on the Bell Witch until 30 years after the fact, like in the 1850s. And the thing is, he was the youngest child, and I've heard about a diary, but I haven't heard anything to say that he kept a diary during the time. And even then, a diary does not necessarily fact make when dealing with extraordinary circumstances. So the vibe seems to me it seems to always come back to his diary, unless there's facts that I'm missing. It could simply be that he made it up all along, because there isn't actually a historical record that I know of John Bell's death at all. It could be that he completely made it up. It could have been that there were unusual circumstances, or maybe like shared delusion, things like that, and he grew up in that environment and then he kind of like wrote about it. But like basically it's an account from someone who wasn't there, based on the account of someone who is trying to remember 30 years back from when he was a small child, and even then you don't know what exactly he was privy to and things like that. And in the case of Andrew Jackson, that verifiably didn't happen. We know where Andrew Jackson was in the 1820s. And also that would have been only 4 or 5 years before he ran for president, and the idea that John Quincy Adams wouldn't have brought it up, like the idea of you were mud wrestling with a witch in bumfuck nowhere Tennessee, and that witch had your pants down, like that would come up in a debate. They'd be like, you're going to elect this man who not only went out searching for a witch but lost.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Um, boy, I'd like to get a clearer idea of like what actually what people were genuinely experiencing and what were just like apocryphal tales, because you said that the community like started making up their own like stories about this, and they were really
Mm,
fascinated with what was going on and whatnot. And but so it's just interesting to me that there's a disparity between um there's stuff that's clearly apocryphal, stuff that community was clearly making up, but then there were people
yeah,
making real decisions for their lives based on fear of this thing. So that's
because
just
I
that's
I tend to think here that in order for that book to have been, written to begin with, I tend to think, well, that must have been based on something, even if it was just lies. Say, like, the Amityville Horror.
yeah.
Everybody knows about Amityville, and every single little thing about the Amityville Horror is completely made up.
Hmm.
But enough people believe that it was true that like a multi-million-dollar franchise could be made out of it. So I could believe that at the very least the hysteria in the town and the town having this fascination with this story and making up their own stories about. I personally, I think that happened. Um, Maybe I'm missing a detail. I think that at the very least, there were stories that were being told about that house and about that haunting at that point in time in history that the town learned of and then became like oral tradition. Like
Right.
I don't think this came out of the gate and like, like the youngest Bell's son and like Martin Ingram were like, this will just make for a good ghost story. Like I think that at the very least there might have been some charlatanism that led to it spreading around the town and the town believing in a haunting.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering like and it would be interesting for me to look into um because I wonder if this is something like at the root of this thing. I wonder if this is something like the oh, who was the guy? The guy who said he was abducted by aliens. The movie Fire in the
Yes,
Sky was based on him. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but
it was
I Walton,
Travis
Walton.
Travis Walton. Yes.
Travis Walton. I Something happened to that guy. I don't think he was abducted by aliens, but something happened to that guy.
Sure.
And I wonder if at the root of this something happened to somebody in this family to cause them to feel the way that they did, that later turned into all of this folklore. Um,
For me, reading between the lines
hmm.
of the accounts there, I got the distinct vibe that at the heart of this story might actually be child abuse. Um,
Oh.
because um, assuming truth, assuming that there's some truth to it, I couldn't help but notice that it was the eldest daughter that always seemed to cop it. Um,
Mm.
Always like she's getting the worst beatings, and not only does she get the worst beatings, but she's so scared for her own life that she calls off an engagement to what seemed to be a nice man. And of course
Yeah.
the story may be, oh well, I feared for my life because the Bell Witch didn't like it. But like, is it unreasonable that a disapproving father or mother, you know,
Hmm.
and again, that's making a bit of an accusation on my part, and obviously I wasn't there and I don't know, but it stuck out to me. It stuck out to me that she specifically seemed to cop it, and it seemed to be that she was not only not only physically attacked, but her life decisions were controlled in a way
Yeah.
that, to me, reminded me of abusive parents.
Right. Right.
Especially in the standards of the time.
It's funny. I was tempted to ask you, is there any record of there being abuse in the family? But there wouldn't be, really, because they didn't consider it that back then. Like,
Exactly.
that was, yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that I wondered about. Now, there's other aspects of this now. So, that land still exists. The house doesn't anymore. But in a really interesting example for me of like the folklore living on and adapting and changing, we do have the Bellwich Cave, and that is a system of untouched caves that run under the ground that the Bell family owned, and it's kind of interesting because in the folklore, as I've heard it, the Bellwich Cave basically has nothing to do with it. The only thing I heard was a story that I literally I don't believe this is true, even in relation to the Bellwitch story. If you proved to me that everything that I told you in that story happened, I still think that this bit would be someone lying, which is that Betsy Bell allegedly went exploring the caves with her brother, and she was scolded by the Bell Witch for exploring the caves because they are dangerous. And that's the only one I really heard of the caves playing a part in this story. And I'm sorry, I don't believe that. If I'm taking you at face value and saying the Bell Witch is real, I don't believe at all that she remotely considers Betsy's safety.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would seem to be embellished.
Yeah. And
Well, yeah, and it's so fun. No, I was gonna say, it's so funny how that works in the development of legends, where these tangential things start attaching themselves to pre-existing stories, like the caves and all that.
yeah, and people explore the caves now. They're a tourist attraction, and people go in, and sometimes you hear it said that when the house was destroyed, the spirit of the Bell Witch fled down into the caves. And that's usually the justification for how people will go to the caves. And people go into those caves all the time, and they all come out and they say, "Oh, I felt something," or "Something happened down there." To which my argument is be like, yeah, but I could go down there as a complete skeptic and non-believer and come out of there feeling like something had happened because you were in a cave that you were told was haunted. Yeah, yeah.
It's like when people go. Yeah, it's like when people visit the Queen Mary and everybody hears little children or something, or like, as you say, expected ghostly sounds and all that.
Well, what I find really interesting about the Bell Witch is when I was reading it, I was surprised by how modern the hauntings seem to be. Like when people say like she was like scratched and hit, and like bed sheets being pulled off, all stuff that hypothetically a parent could do to their kids, and then gaslight the kid into thinking that they're, not to make accusations that that's certainly what happened, but I always think that that's more or less what it is. And I just thought it was really weird that it was still like, say, like the Enfield poltergeist, which is the famous one from this country, or like Amityville and things like that. And I always think it's interesting. They always sort of normally it's like you look for the most popular media representation of something like that happening, and then watch as all of the sightings of this ghost or whatever change. Like, for example, the Loch Ness Monster was not described as being anything remotely like a plesiosaur until
Yeah.
the surgeon's photo, and then all of a sudden everyone was seeing a plesiosaur, even though it was like a fucking slug monster originally. Like,
Yeah.
so like that's what I find quite interesting with the Bellwitch Haunting, is that when I like sort of read it, it does sort of read like something that someone came up with in, say, like the 1970s.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. And which would actually make sense because that's when like wildly exaggerated tales of hauntings and the paranormal and stuff were really coming into their own.
It makes me wonder whether or not, because obviously we know that the authenticated history of the Blair Witch book, we know that that obviously is that account, regardless of what did or did not happen, that book is actually over 100 years old. It's like 150 years old. So like we know that as like a fact, which makes me wonder, is this particular haunting like so famous that like the Amityville sort of stuff was influenced by that in sort of the way of like a folk legend, which I do kind of think that stuff like I do think that stuff like the Amityville Haunting and all the stuff that the Conjuring movies now do, I do think that they are like folk Americana kind of legends, regardless of like whether or not you can get into the nitty gritty of like, you know, Ed and Lorraine Warren were hucksters or whatever, like whatever spin you want to take on it, but like that is sort of like modern folk horror, and I wonder whether or not that was inspired by the Bell Witch, which is apparently one of the older ones.
Do me a favor, real quick, because you said something that intrigued me. I don't know anything about this. I never read the book or saw any of the movies. What is the deal with the Amityville Horror? What was that?
Right, the Amityville Horror. Right, so this is a super abbreviated version of it, because the Amityville Horror really, you could do a whole episode on it. And when I was looking at hauntings, I went with the Bell Witch because I thought like everything about the Amityville Horror has been, you know, done to death. But basically, in the 70s, a guy called Ronald Defoe Jr., a real person, shot and killed 6 members of his family in this house, and he was put in prison. And
so
then,
this is true.
This happened. So this was in November, and he shot and killed his family, and then he was convicted of 2nd-degree murder, and in a year later, November 75, he was put in prison, and then a month, 2 months after that, the Lutz family moved in. And the Lutz family, they moved in, and from there they started to describe all of the same kind of things that what you get in the Bell Witch Haunting, like strange, like unexplained goings on, and you know, like come out in lumps and bruises and things like that. And basically, it wasn't the OG haunted house. The best I can tell, for America at least, the Bell Witch is the OG haunted house. But basically, what happened was a book was written and it claimed to be based on the real experiences of the Lutz family. But there has been loads of lawsuits and, you know, like hot takes on the fact that this book is clearly a horror novel that is a work of fiction that is like ever so slightly, you know, like ever so slightly entirely made up. And
it sounds to me like, just from what I'm reading here, just from what I'm skimming around, it sounds to me like these people moved in and a couple of like slightly creepy things happened to them, and then they turned that into a book where like ghosts and demons were like literally physically harming them and stuff like that.
Essentially, yes, and I do believe that that's probably what the Bell Witch is. I imagine the Bell Witch is the colonial era version of that. Of you've got the authenticated history, which is adapted from the journals of one of the guys who was there, but he was a kid and he's recording back like 50 years himself. So like you've got it's Chinese whispers basically. And I so like, because the Amityville Horror is a similar sort of thing, and I think with Amityville it is quite clearly made up. Like it was it's Fargo. If you've ever seen the film Fargo claims to be Fargo claims to be based on true events, and it's not. And the Coen brothers, basically, they said that they wanted to make a film based on true events, but they didn't want to adapt true events. So they decided to basically make a biopic for events that never happened, but present it like it was inspired by true events. So basically what it is that's just a long-winded way of saying they fucking lied. Well, because that was it should have been, and what I like about Fargo is that it is or should have been a good demonstration to everybody that anybody can say based on a true story, and it doesn't have to be based on a true story. Wow, the Amityville house today is actually kind of nice. Oh yeah, it was
a nice looking house.
It was probably nice at the time as well. Like it gets absolutely fucked up in movies, and people make it look like the most creepy house they possibly could. But
it does look like it was nice then. They've done several renovations to it, and apparently they changed the name, or they changed the street number to discourage people from like going and hanging around. But it's a nice looking house today. Dang. Yeah.
And it has that same appeal as the Bell Witch, which is that it's much like the film The Exorcist. The reason The Exorcist was kind of scary is that house is in no way a horror movie house. It's just a house.
Yeah.
Nice decoration, nice lighting. It's a pretty house, and then horrible things happen in it. Whereas, today when you see a horror film, like you look at that house from afar and you hear the crash of lightning.
Yeah.
You step inside and a zombie goes, "Get out," and they're like, "This will do us. We'll live here." Like, and you're like, "Well, why would you stay here? This is so obviously a terrifying house." But I think the Bell Witch and Amityville kind of had the same thing of like, the Bell family were a fairly well-off middle-class family. And that horror creeps in to this nice middle class home. Obviously, we look at it. We would look at it today and be like, they kept slaves. So we'll be seeing like the cracks and stuff like that, where we're like, oh, this wasn't a very nice place at all, was it? But by those standards of that time, that's like the not affluent, but the well-off, like comfortable equivalent of the middle class back then, and the horror creeps inside and poisons what should be a nice farmhouse.
Just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, because this sort of horror story, this is always affecting the middle class. Like, you don't hear about creepy ghost stories in stuff like big apartment blocks in like Detroit or Harlem or other sort of areas that are more run down, because they don't concern themselves with those sort of things, because those difficulties of life are there and are present. They're like, those people do not need to be scared of things that go bump in the night, because they have very real societal fears that already exist.
Yes.
Sorry, what was you going to say?
No, that's very true. That's very true. I was just curious if you knew about the anything about the background of the Exorcist.
The Exorcist is a novel.
Oh, so
Yeah.
just to kind of head you off at the past there. I do know about the background of The Exorcist. I was just curious if you did.
Yeah, so The Exorcist, it was based on these exorcisms that happened in the 1940s, and these cases were particularly like famous and newspaper stuff, and there was like a sort of a conversation in the papers of like demons don't really exist, fellas. And obviously 30 years on, when William Peter Blatty writes the book, and he also wrote the screenplay for the film. The film and the book are very similar, and they're both masterpieces, but the book is ever so slightly better, I think. And the book goes into all of these, like, every possible scientific explanation to the best of their knowledge in the 70s is tried, tested, and fails, because they rule out every single psychological phenomenon that could possibly be affecting Reagan, by which she could be mentally ill. And finally, when those final like alibis of things that could be, you have to face the realization this is a demon. And it is based, well, not based on, it's not directly based on any of them, but the sort of the things like the levitating girl and things like that, all come from these real life hauntings. Okay, so yeah, and you asked if I knew what The Exorcist was, so you had a take there?
Oh no, I just thought it was interesting. No, not really. It probably wasn't even a good thing to bring up. I was just thought it was interesting that it was an amalgamation of a whole bunch of different things. And
yeah. So I look at the Bellwitch and I wonder if things like The Exorcist and if this is maybe like a linchpin in some way for how these stories go in like American circles.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing that made me curious, especially with the Enfield poltergeist, was that the Enfield poltergeist sounded and was very similar to the Exorcist film. And so that was the famous one here. But when you look at like older British ghost stories, they're different. They're not so much like bed sheets being pulled off you, some sort of mysterious entity slapping you. They're usually more like, well, gothic, as you could well imagine.
Sure.
You know, like the forlorn like ghost waiting for her long lost lover to return to her, things like that. Like they are different, and this was part of the reason why I always believed that the Enfield poltergeist was like a hoax, is like trace the line back. It's very, very similar to the Exorcist film, which came out 3 or 4 years before that haunting happened. And it just so happens that after that film comes out, all of a sudden this famous English possession case has this girl talking like this and stuff like that, and I just and that's why I wonder if maybe I would have to do more research. There might be other stories like unrelated to this, but it at the very least feels to me like this might be a soft origin for a lot of the sort of possession, haunted house things, at least in terms of America, because this story basically became like an oral tradition, not just in Tennessee, but in like surrounding states.
Yeah.
And they all tell different versions of the Bellwitch story.
Maybe that could be an episode in the future, is the origin of that, like tracing some of these pop culture ghosts and possession stories to their roots.
Oh, for sure. Well, that was This Spooky Dance. We've talked about the Bellwitch. The psychics somehow wormed their way back into the conversation. Maybe they really do have powers. Thank you as always, Gabriel.
Thank you.
And it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me as well.
See you later.
Bye.